Hi. As I said, I'm going to start with my grandfather's story. Like I said, my grandfather has an extremely brilliant work ethic, and he really promotes education. And in the Italian families, that wasn't always really a value, especially for families that came to the United States. I live in Staten Island, New York. Staten Island, New York is predominantly Italian American. Usually it's not necessarily first generation, but even so, when it is first generation, a lot of parents don't necessarily encourage education. For me to go to Rhode Island to school, which is customary in certain areas, was very different for me because I went so far from home. Okay, so just picture growing up on this small island that's about 13 miles long, and most people stay there and they work and they operate their family business. So yes, indeed, they have the good work ethic, but education is not necessarily noticed or advocated or encouraged by parents. Okay, so I'm going to take you around the 1850s, according to my grandfather. This is just a brief note. My grandfather's mother, who is my great grandmother, we refer to her as Isa's mama. Isa mama. She was part of the Italian royalty, and it can be traced back until the 1850s. My mom did a family tree project one time, and it said that she had royal blood in her, blue blood. Okay, my grandfather's father, we called him Isa Papa. The reason we're using the term Isa is because Isa is my grandfather's sister, also known as my Aunt Isa. Okay, so so we said that my great grandfather, he was an aristocrat per se. He was like an aristocrat. When he was born, I believe he was born in 1908. 1908, yes. He was born in 1908, and he was considered an aristocrat. At first, he was going into the priesthood. He was in the priesthood for a year, didn't really like it. He was always very education-oriented. He was part of the aristocracy. He didn't hang out with the common people. He spoke to develop his knowledge, to further cultivate his mind, okay? So he went to the priesthood for a year, didn't like it, went to law school for 2 years, and he studied law. He wasn't a practicing lawyer, but he did study law. And then he went for his doctorate in both the English language and the Italian language, and he was a professor of Italian literature, okay? So he's a professor. He was very into education, and it wasn't necessarily encouraged, especially in Italy at the time. I'd like to know my grandfather's from an area called Trigiano, which is in Bari, which is by the southern boot of Italy, okay? So my great-grandfather, he really supported his children to get their education, and they needed to get it, okay? So when my grandfather was born, and my grandfather came to the U.S. around 16 years old, he decided to obviously go to high school, and he went to high school at night, and he found a job during the day so he could make money, but also incorporate some experience to his life. My grandfather right now is a carbide tool manufacturer. He has a carbide tool manufacturing company. And he was always into that. He was very into engineering. He was always into the machinery and the robots and so on and so forth. So he found a job like that, and he studied at night. He then went to technical school, where he studied, I would compare it to, now we're talking he was born in 1943. So we're talking about late 1950s. Late 1950s. So he studied the equivalent of like mechanical engineering. Okay? Mechanical engineering, that's what I would call it. And he did very well in trade school. Actually, in January, he took a test for IBM. He was the only person to get 100 on that test. He was the first one to get a job offer. However, my grandfather refused the job with IBM because they would not allow him to graduate school first. Instead, they want him to leave in January. My grandfather said, absolutely not, I want a tangible degree. That's what his father passed on to him. You needed that degree. And so on. When my grandfather had my mother, her name is Stella, and when my grandfather had my aunt, Christine, education was always important to the household. You needed your education. Remember, growing up in an Italian family, and at this time they lived in Brooklyn. Okay, so we're jumping. My grandfather went from Italy to Brooklyn, New York. And he went to, like I said, he went to New York when he was around 15, 16 years old, okay? And when he had my mom, it was funny because he was actually in the Air Force at the time. After he completed school, he went to the Air Force, okay? So when he came home from the Air Force, this is during Vietnam, okay? So after he came home from the Air Force, so now we're talking later 1960s, because my mom was born in 1967. So after my mom was born, education was always a thing. And midway into my mother's life, my grandfather developed and started his own carbide tool manufacturing company along with 2 other partners. It's funny because my mom was not allowed to get married until she had her degree and she had a profession. My mother's a teacher, 3rd, 4th degree in science. And she was not allowed to get married. And she was over the age of 21, was not allowed to get married until she had that degree in her hand. And same thing went for my aunt. So my grandfather really stressed that. Growing up in an Italian home, like I said, women are typically sheltered. You don't leave the home until you're married. Education's not necessarily necessary because you need to cook and clean all day. And my grandfather really didn't advocate and encourage that traditionalism in the household. He wanted his daughters to be educated. He wanted the best for them. My grandfather always said this one motto to me. And he said, when you get married, he said, find somebody who's either as smart as you or smarter than you. Okay? That's how much he cared about education. He said, because somebody's smarter than you, they care about what their children will do. And they really support and encourage education so they grow and they strengthen themselves. So it's a little bit about my grandfather. My grandfather's a wonderful person. He's a very generous man. At the time now, like I said, he's 72. He still works, okay? He works every day, including the holidays, because he'll still go in. He works from 8:30 in the morning until 5 o'clock at night. He's 72. He loves what he does, or he wouldn't be doing it. He loves it, okay? He works alongside 2 other partners, and they own the company together. And he operates the robots that manufacture the tools, and they distribute the tools all over the world. He's had this successful business since either the late 70s or the early 80s. He's been doing great. In 1997, we moved to Staten Island, New York, and he continued the business over there. So that's a little tidbit about my grandfather. Like I said, the value that I incorporate into him is education and hard work ethic. Okay?